The main thing is to get her to sign the power of attorney before her condition deteriorates. Otherwise, we'll have to declare her incompetent through the court, and that's long and expensive." I stopped breathing. The words, as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, seeped through the oak door of my late husband's study and sliced through the silence of the Tuesday afternoon. Behind that door, my son, Simon, was discussing my future with a lawyer on speakerphone, confident that I was taking my usual 4 o'clock stroll through the garden. But the roses had lost their scent today, and I had come back early. I stood in the hallway, feeling the stack of papers I had signed last week for the tax office transform before my eyes into the bars of my future prison. I didn't knock. I didn't enter. I just listened as my child, my only child, methodically planned my legal death. I turned silently and, my feet making no sound on the plush carpet, returned to the kitchen. The air was thick with the aroma of the apple pie I had baked for him that morning, his favorite, with cinnamon. It was still warm on the counter, covered with a linen towel. In a few minutes, Simon would emerge from the study, cheerful and smiling, kiss my cheek, tell me how wonderful it smelled, and take the pie with him to his family. I stared at that pie, at its golden crust and the elegant slits from which sweet steam escaped, and I felt nothing but an icy coldness inside. Simon's loud laugh echoed from the study as he ended the call, but it sounded distant, as if I were hearing it from underwater. Everything around me had lost its taste, its color, its smell. All that remained was a ringing in my ears and the stark realization I was an object, not a mother, not Evelyn, an asset worth over $2 million that needed to be properly managed. When the front door closed behind him and the sound of his car faded into the distance, the house fell into a deafening silence. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, where the scent of my care still lingered, and looked at the coffee cup he had left on the table, a small brown stain on the white porcelain, his trace, his presence. I slowly walked to the sink, turned on the hot water, and began to methodically wash that single cup. The scalding water burned my fingers, but I paid it no mind. I scrubbed it with the sponge again and again, as if trying to erase not the coffee stain, but the very fact of his existence in my home, in my life. I dried it until it squeaked and placed it on the shelf. It was my first act of liberation, erasing the evidence. I sat down at the kitchen table, and the memories I had carefully filed away for years began to spill out, sharp and disordered. The first was from 2017, a month after my husband's death. His study, still smelling of cigars and expensive cologne. I was sitting in his massive leather chair, feeling lost and broken. Simon sat across from me, his voice soft and full of sympathy. "Mom, I know how hard this island, all these papers, the accounts, the assets, it's such a burden. Let me take this off your hands. Sign this general power of attorney, and you'll never have to think about it again. I'll take care of everything." His words felt like a lifeline. I looked into his eyes, which seemed as honest as his father's, then felt only gratitude. I signed without reading. My signature, made with my husband's expensive fountain pen, was an act of absolute blind trust. I was handing him not just the management of assets, I was handing him the legacy of our life together, certain he would protect it like a precious treasure. Then a second memory surfaced, much more recent, from last week, the same kitchen where I sat now. Simon had rushed in for a moment, flustered, holding a folder. "Mom, just a small thing for the tax office, a formality. You just need to sign here." He handed me a cheap ballpoint pen and pointed to where I should initial and sign. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling a strange prick of anxiety. "What is this exactly?" I asked. "Oh, Mom, don't worry your head about it. It's just for optimization, so we pay less to the government. You trust me, don't you?" And that phrase, "you trust me, don't you," was the key. Of course, I did. I signed. I felt like a paper boat in the hands of a child who had decided to see if it would sink. Now, in the silence of the kitchen, those two memories merged into one horrific picture. The power of attorney was the foundation. The tax papers were the walls. And today's conversation with the lawyer was the roof of my prison. I realized I wasn't family. I was a resource. The worst part wasn't that he wanted my money. The worst part was that he had coldly and meticulously scripted my descent into madness, my own incompetence. In that moment, the trust I had built my entire life shattered into 1,000 pieces, and every shard was as sharp as glass, reflecting my naive, deceived face. I stood up and, without hesitation, walked into my husband's study. It was no longer a place of mourning. It was now my war room. I went to the heavy safe hidden behind a seascape painting and confidently dialed the combination our wedding date. The door swung open silently. Inside, in a leather portfolio, were the originals. There it was, the power of attorney from 2017, on thick, slightly yellowed paper. And here was the fresh one, signed last week on crisp white stock. I laid them side by side on the desk, under the green glow of his lamp. The evidence, not of my madness, but of his betrayal. My gaze fell on my husband's old address book. I opened it to V, Arthur Vance, his first partner, an old friend, now retired. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the number. After a few rings, I heard his familiar, gravelly voice. "Arthur, it's Evelyn," I said, and my own voice sounded surprisingly steady and firm. "I need your advice. My son and his lawyer believe my condition is deteriorating, and they're preparing documents to declare me incompetent. I want to fight it." There was a pause on the other end, and then he said, "I'll be there in an hour. Don't sign anything else. Don't talk to anyone. Wait for me." I hung up the phone. I took my late husband's heavy bronze seal, engraved with his initials, from the shelf. Simon had once asked for it for his office, as a symbol of succession. I had refused him then. Now, I clutched it in my hand. The cold metal gave me strength. He thought my signature was a sign of my weakness, of a trust so easily exploited. He didn't know I was capable of making not just signatures, but full stops. That night I sat in the dark study, staring at the documents on the desk. I realized I hadn't lost my son. I had simply accepted that the version of him I had loved with all my heart had only ever existed in my memory. The man who drank my coffee this morning was just a stranger I would have to meet in court, and I was ready. The next morning, I drove to Arthur Vance's house. His home office was nothing like the grand, imposing space my husband had occupied. It was a quiet sanctuary lined with worn, leather-bound law books that smelled of paper and time. A gentle light filtered through the bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur, with his kind eyes and steady hands, poured me a cup of black coffee before sitting opposite me at his polished mahogany desk. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet, professional respect. My heart did not pound. My voice did not waver. I placed the two power of attorney documents on the desk between us. "Arthur," I began, my voice clear and even, "I want to revoke this immediately, the one from last week and the one from 2017, and I need to draft a new will." This was not an act of revenge. This was a repair. Arthur reviewed the documents with the focused calm of a master craftsman inspecting a damaged heirloom. "The revocation is straightforward, Evelyn. We will file it today and serve notice to Simon and his counsel. It will be an unequivocal termination of his authority." He then slid a fresh legal pad towards him. "Now the will." "What are your intentions?" I didn't hesitate. "I want to liquidate a significant portion of the estate to establish a foundation, the Evelyn Thorne Foundation for Senior Legal Aid. It will provide pro bono legal services to elderly individuals facing financial abuse from their own families." I saw a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. He wasn't just my lawyer. He was the executor of my new purpose. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the legal architecture of my freedom, discussing fiduciary duties, trust agreements, and the process for the annulment of fraudulent transactions. I wasn't just a client, I was a strategist, reclaiming my territory, one clause at a time. My first stop after leaving Arthur's was the bank. The building was an imposing structure of cold marble and glass, designed to feel permanent and secure. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of currency and disinfectant. I was escorted to the bank manager's office, a glass-walled cube that offered a panoramic view of the tellers below. I sat down and calmly stated my purpose. I am Evelyn Thorne. I need to freeze all my accounts immediately, requiring my dual signature and personal presence for any transaction over $500. Furthermore, I need to remove Mr. Simon Thorne's access from this joint savings account. The manager, a polished man in a crisp suit, typed briskly into his computer. As the keyboard clicked, my eyes drifted to a young couple at a nearby desk, helping their small son open his first savings account. The boy, no older than 7, clutched a single, crumpled $20 bill, his face alight with pride. A memory, sharp and bittersweet, pierced through my composure. Simon, at that same age, his small, warm hand in mine standing at this very counter. "It's for my future, Mommy," he had whispered, his eyes wide with wonder as he slid his allowance across the polished marble. I blinked, pushing the ghost of that boy away. That boy was gone. The man who had taken his place was a stranger, and I was simply closing a door he no longer had the key to. That evening, the red light on my home answering machine was blinking furiously. One new message. I pressed the play button, my hand resting on the cool surface of the kitchen counter. Simon's voice filled the silence, tight with a manufactured concern that failed to mask the panic underneath. "Mom, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all day." The bank called. "Something is wrong with the accounts. They said they're frozen." "I'm worried about you, Mom." "Please, just call me back and let me know you're okay." I listened to the message twice. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his access. He wasn't concerned. He was alarmed. The carefully constructed world where he was the benevolent protector and I was the frail dependent had just collapsed. I calmly pressed the delete button. The blinking red light went out. The following days were a series of methodical repairs. On Wednesday, a locksmith came and changed every lock on the house, handing me a set of new, gleaming brass keys that felt heavy and real in my palm. The sound of the drill biting into the old wood of the door frames was the sound of my fortress being secured. On Thursday, I spent the afternoon in the garden, not for leisure, but for labor. I put on my husband's old gardening gloves and systematically pulled weeds from the rose beds, my hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. Each weed I ripped out, roots and all, felt like a toxic thought being removed from my mind. As I worked, my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, leaned over the fence. "Your roses are looking beautiful this year, Evelyn," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you, Carol," I replied, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. "I'm just doing a bit of overdue maintenance." It was a simple, Normal conversation, a reminder that the world was still filled with good people, and I was not isolating myself from it, only from the poison. By the weekend, the major structural repairs were complete. Now it was time for the symbolic touches. I retrieved a large archival box from the attic. Into it, I placed everything that belonged to Simon's chapter in my life: his birth certificate, his childhood report cards, framed photographs of him as a boy, as a graduate, as a groom. I didn't burn them. I didn't destroy them. They were facts, pieces of a life that had happened. I sealed the box and, with a black marker, wrote on the side in neat block letters, "History, Simon Thorne." Then I opened my old, leather-bound address book to the T section. I found his name, address, and phone number written years ago in my own optimistic script. I took a fountain pen filled with black ink and drew a single, clean, unwavering line through the entire entry. It was a quiet, final edit. Finally, I sat at my husband's desk and unrolled the draft charter for the foundation Arthur had prepared. I picked up my husband's bronze seal and a stick of crimson wax. I lit the wax and let a perfect, circular pool form at the bottom of the page. Then I pressed the seal firmly into it. The raised initials, his legacy, now served my purpose. It was not a signature of trust. It was a stamp of intent. That afternoon, after the last of the work was done, I drove into town with no particular destination in mind. I found myself parked in front of La Petite Boulangerie, a tiny bakery I hadn't visited in years because Simon had once complained their coffee was too bitter. I went inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air was warm and smelled of butter, sugar, and toasted almonds. I ignored the elaborate cakes and trays of croissants. My eyes landed on a row of perfect, glistening lemon tarts. My favorite. I bought one. Just one. I didn't take it home. I sat on a bench in the nearby park, the late afternoon sun warming my face. I opened the small white box and took the first bite. The sharp, sweet citrus exploded on my tongue. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't think about what anyone else needed. I chose myself. A week later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, his car pulled into the driveway. I was in the living room, reading by the window, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming on the table beside me. I didn't move. I heard the solid, confident sound of his footsteps on the stone path, followed by the familiar jingle of keys. Then came the soft metallic clink as his key failed to turn in the new lock. A pause. Another try, more forceful this time. A frustrated jangle. Then 3 loud, insistent knocks on the door. I took a slow sip of my tea. The silence in the house was a solid, comforting presence. "Mom?" His voice, muffled by the thick oak door, was laced with an unfamiliar uncertainty. "Mom, are you in there?" "What's going on with the locks? I just want to talk." He knocked again, the sound echoing through the empty hall. I turned a page in my book. I wasn't hiding. I was simply unavailable. My mother used to say, "If they don't hear you when you speak softly, let them hear the silence even louder." As I sat there, listening to the sound of his fading footsteps crunching on the gravel, I realized that for the first time in years, the silence in my house belonged entirely to me. After he was gone, I set down my book and began to walk through the rooms of the house. It wasn't a sad walk. It was an inventory, a final tour of a museum dedicated to a life that was now over. I started in Simon's childhood bedroom. The faint scent of old paper and cedar still clung to the air. I ran my hand over the small wooden desk where he used to do his homework. I remembered him sitting there, small and serious, his brow furrowed in concentration as he learned to write his name, a warm, sweet memory. But then, another memory surfaced, cold and sharp. Simon, now a grown man, standing in this same room a year ago. impatiently gesturing around. Honestly, Mom, why do you keep all this junk? We could turn this into a proper guest room. It's just wasted space. The juxtaposition of the two memories didn't hurt anymore. It simply clarified. I moved on to the living room and stopped before my husband's worn leather armchair. For years after his death, I couldn't bear to look at it. Now, I saw it differently. I remembered curling up in it with a 5-year-old Simon, reading him bedtime stories, his sleepy head resting against my chest, his small hand clutching my finger. That was real. That had happened. But so had the countless evenings when a teenage Simon would storm past the chair, ignoring my greeting, headphones blasting, already a world away. And the more recent years, when he would sit in it, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up as I tried to tell him about my day. The chair wasn't a shrine to a lost happiness. It was a silent witness to a slow, imperceptible erosion. My final stop was the kitchen, the heart of the home, the source of so many aromas and memories of care. I stood by the large wooden table, its surface scarred with the history of our family, a small burn mark from a forgotten pot, a series of nicks where Simon had carved his initials as a boy. I remembered the boisterous family dinners, the kitchen filled with laughter and the smell of roasting chicken. But I also remembered the last Thanksgiving, just a few months ago. I had spent 2 days cooking. Simon and his family arrived late, ate quickly, and barely spoke to me, their attention glued to their phones. He had pushed away his half-eaten plate of my famous apple pie and said, "We really have to go, Mom. Busy day tomorrow." The love I had poured into that meal had been consumed as a convenience, not a gift. After my inventory was complete, I sat down at that same table with a notebook and a pen. On one side of the page, I wrote, "To keep." On the other, "To leave behind." The first list was surprisingly short. The second was long, but writing it felt like shedding a great weight. The next day, the packing began. It was a methodical, meditative process. I didn't rush. The house was quiet, filled with the soft light of a clear autumn day. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust-free surfaces. I wasn't just packing boxes. I was curating my future. I decided to start with the books from my husband's study. They were not just objects. They were the architecture of his mind and the foundation of my new purpose. I took down a first edition of Commentaries on the Laws of England, its leather cover worn smooth with age. I remembered my husband reading passages aloud to me, his voice filled with passion for the principles of justice. This was his true legacy, not the money Simon coveted, but the ideals he lived by. I carefully wrapped each heavy volume in soft archival tissue paper, the crinkling sound a gentle counterpoint to the silence. I placed them one by one into a sturdy cardboard box. I wasn't just packing books. I was packing my arsenal. These volumes would form the initial library for the Foundation's Resource Center. They were the tools I would use to help others fight the same battles I was now winning. When the last book was settled, I sealed the box with heavy-duty tape. I took a black marker and, in my neatest handwriting, wrote on the side, not office or books. I wrote, future. When the last box was sealed, I stood in the middle of the study and looked around. The empty shelves didn't look barren. They looked clean, ready for new stories, stories that would be written without me. My work here was done. The first phone call I made after the house was cleared was to a real estate agent specializing in downtown apartments. I said, my voice steady, "I'm looking for a 1-bedroom rental, something with good light and a view of the city. No garden necessary." The agent's cheerful efficiency was a balm to my soul. An hour later, my inbox was filled with listings, each one a small, shimmering portal to a new life. That afternoon, instead of tending to the sprawling rose bushes that demanded constant care, I sat on my front porch in a simple wicker chair, a book unread in my lap, and just watched the world go by. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't listening for the sound of a familiar car. The quiet was no longer a void left by someone's absence. It was a space filled with my own presence. I thought of Simon then, not with anger, but with a strange, clinical detachment. I realized I wasn't mourning the man he had become. I was mourning the idea of the son I thought I had, the idealized memory of a small boy with honest eyes, and mourning an idea I discovered is a grief you can eventually set down. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tentative, fragile. "Grandma? It's Chloe, Simon's 17-year-old daughter." I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. "Grandma, I'm so sorry." The words were a whisper, tangled in shame. The old Evelyn would have rushed to comfort her, to absolve her. "It's all right, dear. It wasn't your fault." But I was not the old Evelyn. I held the phone, the warmth of the setting sun on my face, and asked quietly, "Chloe, what are you sorry for?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her shaky breath. For everything," she finally stammered. "For not saying anything. For being there that day at Thanksgiving when Dad was so awful. For just going along with it." Her confession was clumsy, unpolished, and for that reason, utterly sincere. It wasn't a performance. It was a crack of light under a door I thought was sealed shut. "I see," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for telling me that. It takes courage." Another pause. Can I see you?" she asked, her voice small. I want to see you." I considered this, not as a grandmother, but as the architect of my new life. This couldn't be a return to the past. It had to be the beginning of something new. "Yes, you can," I replied. "Come tomorrow at 3, but Chloe, you must come alone." The next day, the grandfather clock in my hall chimed 3 times, its steady rhythm a contrast to the nervous, hesitant knock at the door. I opened it to find Chloe standing on the porch, clutching a small bouquet of daisies, her shoulders hunched against the chilly autumn air. She looked lost. I didn't hug her. I simply stepped back and said, "Come in out of the cold." I led her into the kitchen, which was now warm and smelled of cinnamon and freshly baked shortbread. I poured us both a cup of tea and set the plate of cookies between us on the scrubbed wooden table. The atmosphere was not one of warm family reunion. It was polite, quiet, a little awkward. She placed the daisies and a glass of water on the counter. "I didn't know what to do," she began, twisting a napkin in her hands. "Dad was so angry when he found out about the bank accounts. He said you weren't well, but I heard him on the phone with the lawyer. I knew what he was planning." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a conflict that was far too heavy for a 17-year-old to bear. I was just scared of him, of disagreeing with him. I listened, not judging, not interrupting. When she finished, I took a sip of my tea. "You weren't scared of him, Chloe," I said softly. "You were scared of not belonging to him, to them. It's a powerful need, the need to belong to your family." My words weren't an accusation. They were a diagnosis. I saw a flicker of understanding, of relief, in her eyes. I wasn't angry with her. I simply saw the truth of her situation. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the clink of our teacups against their saucers. The simple taste of the buttery shortbread was grounding, a return to something honest and real. Can I come back, Grandma? She asked finally, her voice barely audible. Will you let me visit again? This was the crucial moment, the test of my new resolve. I looked at her, at this young woman caught between a broken past and an uncertain future. Yes, I said, you can always come back, but not for the pie, and not because you feel guilty. You can come back when you want to have an honest conversation, just you and me. That's the new rule. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. I'd like that, she said. When she left an hour later, I wrapped 3 shortbread cookies in a napkin and placed them in her hand. It wasn't a peace offering. It was the first installment on a new kind of contract. That evening, I stood by the window and watched the rain begin to fall, tracing silver paths down the glass. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It held the echo of a real conversation. Perhaps some doors shouldn't be bolted and barricaded forever. Perhaps they only need to be locked gently from the inside, leaving a window cracked open just enough for the ones who learn to knock softly and who are brave enough to come alone. On a crisp Monday morning, I dressed with deliberate care. I chose a simple navy blue wool dress, the one I always felt most confident in, and fastened my late husband's small, elegant watch around my wrist. Its familiar weight was a quiet reassurance. My destination was a downtown high-rise, a building of steel and glass that pierced the bright autumn sky. The real estate agent, a sharp woman named Miss Davies, met me in the lobby. It's on the 15th floor, Mrs. Thorne. The view is spectacular, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast marble hall. The apartment was exactly as the pictures had promised, but the images hadn't captured the feeling of it. They hadn't captured the scent of fresh paint and new carpets, the soft hum of the city far below, or the way the morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the empty rooms into vast canvases of possibility. I walked from the open-plan living area to the small balcony, the cool metal railing solid under my hand. Below, the city moved with a vibrant, relentless energy. There was no sprawling garden demanding my attention, no echoes of past conversations in the empty hallways. It was a blank slate. I'll take it, I said, my voice clear and certain. The decision felt less like a choice and more like an arrival. Back in her office, signing the lease, the smell of leather and fresh paper filled the air. As I slid the signed contract across the polished desk, I felt a profound sense of finality. I then took out my checkbook and wrote a deposit check for the full year's rent in advance. It wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a declaration. I was investing in myself, fully and without reservation. The next day brought the inevitable emotional reckoning. I was in the process of packing my husband's most treasured books, the ones I was taking to the foundation, when the doorbell rang. I knew it was Simon. I had seen his car pull up through the window. He didn't knock. He just rang the bell, a long, impatient peal, as if he still had the right to demand entry. I continued my work, carefully wrapping a fragile copy of Plato's Republic in soft cloth. The bell rang again, followed by his voice, strained and pleading, through the mail slot. "Mom? Mom, please. I know you're in there. We need to talk." I walked to the door and stood a foot away from it, my back to the solid oak. "There is nothing to talk about, Simon," I said, my voice calm, carrying easily through the wood. "Everything that needed to be said has been filed by my lawyer." "Mom, this is insane," he protested, his voice rising. "This foundation, it's everything Dad and I built. You can't just give it away." I allowed myself a small, sad smile. "Your father built a legal practice based on honor and duty. You tried to build a prison for your own mother. They are not the same thing." He tried a different tactic, his voice softening into a manipulative plea. "What about Chloe? What about your family? You're just going to throw us all away? Chloe knows where to find me, I replied evenly. As for family, trust is a contract, Simon. And when one party breaches it, the other has every right to seek legal remedy. I heard a heavy sigh, the sound of his defeat. He was gone a few moments later. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to cry. It wasn't a storm of grief, but a quiet, cleansing rain. 7 minutes of tears for the son I had lost, for the trust that had been shattered, for the naive woman I used to be. When it was over, I wiped my eyes, went back to my boxes, and continued to pack. That afternoon, my new family arrived, not the one of blood and obligation, but the one of choice and shared history. Carol Gable from next door, and Margaret, my friend from the book club I'd neglected for years. They came bearing not empty platitudes, but a flask of hot tea and a box of freshly baked scones. We sat on the living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes, the air filled with the scent of bergamot and warm butter. The conversation was a gentle stream of simple, everyday things. Carol told a hilarious story about a rogue squirrel that had been stealing her prize-winning tomatoes, and Margaret recounted her recent, disastrous attempt at online dating. Their laughter was a warm, healing balm. It was in that comfortable quiet that I told them, "I'm moving," I said simply. "I've taken an apartment downtown." They didn't gasp or question my decision. Carol simply reached over and squeezed my hand. "Oh, Evelyn, that's wonderful," she said, her eyes shining with genuine happiness for me. Margaret nodded in agreement. "We'll help you unpack, and we will christen the place with the worst bottle of champagne we can find." In that moment, surrounded by their unconditional support, I understood. Family isn't just about who you are born to. It's about who shows up when your world falls apart. The final confrontation came without warning. It was evening, and I was in the garden, taking one last look at the roses under the soft glow of the porch light. The front door, which I had foolishly left unlocked, opened, and Simon walked in. He didn't look defeated. He looked righteous, his face a mask of cold fury. "I cannot believe you are actually going through with this," he began, his voice dripping with condescension as he strode into the living room, a space he still treated as his own. "After everything I have done for you." I followed him inside, closing the door softly behind me. I felt no fear, only a profound weariness. "What is it you think you have done for me, Simon?" I asked, my tone conversational. "Managed my money? Or planned to have me declared incompetent so you could manage it without my consent?" His face tightened. "That was to protect you. To protect the family legacy. You're old. You're becoming forgetful. Someone has to make the hard decisions." This was his first manipulation, the appeal to my supposed frailty. I met his gaze without flinching. "My mind is perfectly sharp, Simon. Sharp enough to understand the precise legal definitions of fraud and undue influence. You thought my signature was a sign of weakness. You never imagined I could use it not just to sign documents, but to end conversations." He shifted his attack. "And the foundation? A ridiculous vanity project. You're throwing away your grandchildren's inheritance on strangers." The second manipulation, guilt. "My inheritance is not a birthright, it is a responsibility," I countered, my voice still quiet. "And I have decided that its true purpose is to defend people from predators like you. You wanted to imprison me with the law. I have decided to liberate others with justice." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You will regret this. You will end up old and alone in some sterile apartment, and there will be no one to help you, no one to even call." This was his final weapon, the prophecy of loneliness. I let the threat hang in the air for a moment. Then I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I would rather be sovereign in my solitude than a prisoner in a house full of people who see me as a balance sheet. You see, you made a critical miscalculation. You thought my life was about you, but it was always about me. I walked over to the desk, picked up a single, beautifully printed brochure, and handed it to him. On the front, in elegant script, it read, "The Evelyn Thorne Foundation for Senior Legal Aid." Below it was a photograph of my husband's seal, his legacy, now mine. He stared at it as if it had burned his hand. The color drained from his face. Every argument, every justification, every ounce of his self-righteous anger crumbled into nothing against the tangible proof of my new reality. He had lost. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a hollow, impotent rage. He turned without another word and walked out, his posture stiff and defeated. The front door clicked shut behind him, the sound as final as a period at the end of a very long sentence. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel sorrow. I felt only quiet. But this time, it was not the quiet of loneliness. It was the quiet of sovereignty. The finality arrived, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet efficiency of a legal process reaching its conclusion. It came in the form of a phone call from Arthur Vance, his voice warm and steady through the line. "It's done, Evelyn," he said. "The foundation is officially chartered, the trusts are secured, and the last of the revocations has been processed and acknowledged. As of this morning, you are the sole and absolute architect of every inch of your life." I thanked him, my own voice calm. There was no surge of elation, only a profound, anchoring sense of peace. The war was over. The last practical step was small but significant. I drove to the post office and closed the shared P.O. box I'd had with Simon for over a decade. The clerk handed me a single, small silver key to my new private box. As it rested in my palm, cool and solid, I knew it was more than just a key. It was the last lock clicking shut on a life that was no longer mine. 2 days before the move, Chloe called and asked if she could come over to help me pack some of the smaller things. She arrived not with anxious apologies, but with a box of donuts and a determined smile. We spent the afternoon in the dusty attic, a space filled with the ghosts of forgotten Christmases and outgrown hobbies. The atmosphere was different this time, easy, companionable. We worked in comfortable silence, punctuated by shared stories about the objects we unearthed. She held up a dusty trophy Simon had won for a school debate. "Dad still talks about this," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "He says you were so proud of him." I paused, sitting back on my heels. "I was," I said honestly. "But Chloe, your father isn't mourning the loss of my pride. He's mourning the loss of an audience he no longer controls." She looked at me, a deep understanding dawning in her eyes. "He doesn't get it, does he? He thinks you're just punishing him?" I nodded. "Some people can't see a boundary without assuming it's an attack." Before she left, she handed me a small, clumsily wrapped package. Inside was a simple, hand-drawn picture, rendered in charcoal. It depicted a single, magnificent old oak tree, its roots deep and strong, standing alone on a hill against a rising sun. "It's you," she whispered. "Strong and on your own." I looked at the drawing, at the fierce, solitary beauty of it, and my throat tightened. "I will hang this in my new home," I promised. "It will be the first thing I put on the wall." The morning of the move was still and quiet, the dawn sky a pale, hopeful gray. The house, stripped of its furniture and art, echoed with every footstep. It felt vast, and empty, like a seashell held to the ear, filled only with the memory of the ocean. I walked through each room one last time, my fingers tracing the faint outlines on the wallpaper where pictures used to hang. I ran my hand along the scarred kitchen table where a family had once shared meals. There was no pain, no lingering anger, only a quiet, deep gratitude for the life that had been lived here, for the lessons learned within these walls. This house had been my sanctuary and my prison, and now it was simply a place I used to live. On the mantelpiece, I left the old front door key. Beside it, I placed a simple note on a crisp white card. It said only, "Thank you for the shelter." Then I walked out the front door, closed it softly behind me, and did not look back. Arriving at the new apartment building was like stepping into a different world. The air in the lobby was warm and smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh flowers. A friendly building manager handed me my keys and a small potted orchid as a welcome gift. Upstairs, the movers were already bringing in the first of the boxes, their cheerful chatter filling the sunlit space. The apartment smelled of possibility. After they left, I stood alone in the center of the living room, surrounded by the neatly stacked architecture of my former life. I knew exactly which box to open first. It was the one marked future. I carefully unwrapped Plato's Republic and placed it on the built-in bookshelf, its ancient wisdom the first stone in my new foundation. Next, I opened the small box containing my personal treasures. I took out Chloe's drawing of the oak tree and propped it up on the kitchen counter. Its quiet strength, a welcome presence in the empty room. Finally, I found my electric kettle, filled it with water, and plugged it in. The simple, familiar sound of it beginning to boil was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. A week later, a new routine had begun to form. My mornings started not with a list of obligations, but with a cup of tea on the balcony, watching the city wake up below. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of my husband's old papers, I found a letter he had written me on our 10th anniversary. I had read it 100 times, but one line now stood out as if written in fire. "Evelyn, your greatest strength is not your kindness, but the fierce, unyielding core of justice within you. Never let anyone convince you to silence it." Tears welled in my eyes. It felt like a blessing, a validation sent across time. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I baked a simple loaf of bread, not for a family gathering, but for myself. The process was a meditation. The feel of the soft dough under my hands, the warm, yeasty smell filling my small kitchen, the satisfying crackle of the crust as it cooled. It was a sacrament of self-sufficiency. As I was slicing the warm bread, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Chloe. She was holding a small, greasy bicycle chain. "Grandma," she said with a grin, "can you help me fix this? You always knew how to fix things." We spent the next hour at my new kitchen table, our hands covered in grease, patiently working the links of the chain back into place. It was simple. It was real. As we finished, she looked around the peaceful, sunlit apartment. "Is this what peace feels like?" she asked. I thought for a moment, the warm slice of bread in my hand. "No, not all of it," I said, "but this is a very important piece of it." Later that night, after Chloe had gone, I sat by the window, looking out at the glittering tapestry of city lights. I didn't miss the big house. I didn't miss the crushing weight of expectation or the carefully constructed smiles. I didn't miss the old version of myself who used to whisper, "Maybe next time they'll see me." Because now, finally, I saw myself, and I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. A soul is not a vessel to be filled, but a structure to be built. For 83 years, I had allowed others to be my architects. They used my trust as mortar and my silence as scaffolding, constructing a life for me that was spacious and well-appointed, but in which every room was designed for their comfort, not my own. When I first heard the cracks forming in the foundation, the cold whisper of my son's voice planning my legal obsolescence, I thought the entire structure would collapse into ruin. I believed that to tear it down would be to destroy myself. I was wrong. Demolition is not destruction. It is the necessary clearing of land. It is the sacred, dusty work of making space for something new to be built, this time with your own two hands, to your own design. The call from the real estate attorney came on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my old life had fractured. "The sale of the house is closed, Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "The funds have been transferred to the foundation's trust account, as per your instructions." I felt a stillness settle over me, a profound quiet where I had expected a pang of loss or a flicker of regret. There was nothing. I had already grieved for that house, for the memories it held, and for the woman who had tended its gardens. Now, it was simply an asset that had been repurposed. Later that day, I walked into the modest downtown office of the Senior Legal Aid Clinic, the same one my foundation now funded. I handed a young, earnest director the final paperwork. She looked at the sum, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This will change everything for us, Mrs. Thorne. It will keep so many people in their homes." I simply nodded, a small smile touching my lips. "This is for the women who are told their signatures are merely a formality," I said softly. I had shed all my tears for that house. This was not grief. This was intention. My apartment, once a symbol of escape, had become a sanctuary. This was never clearer than the day Chloe arrived with a cardboard box tucked under her arm. She looked older, her shoulders straighter than they had been just a few months prior. "Can I keep this here?" she asked, her voice low. "It's my journals and my portfolio for art school. I don't want Dad to see them." I took the box from her without a word and placed it on the top shelf of my linen closet, a quiet, safe harbor. We sat by the window, drinking tea, watching the rain fall. "They're still so angry," she said, not looking at me. "Mom keeps saying you abandoned them. Dad just doesn't talk about you at all." I watched a single raindrop trace a path down the window pane. "They aren't angry at me, Chloe," I explained gently. "They are angry at the mirror I held up to them. People can forgive an injury, but they can rarely forgive a reflection they do not recognize." She looked at me then, her gaze steady. "Can they ever change?" It was a question born of a desperate, youthful hope. I chose my words carefully. "A better question, my dear, is can they ever stop pretending? Change is possible only when the performance ends." She nodded slowly, the bitter truth settling in. She didn't need my comfort anymore. She needed my clarity. A week later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my new mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized Simon's elegant, sloping handwriting immediately. I opened it not with trepidation, but with a detached curiosity. The letter inside was short, a messy scrawl that spoke of late-night desperation. "I don't understand how it came to this," it read. "I was only trying to do what was best. The house is sold. It's all gone. I hope you're happy." It was not an apology. It was a lament, a self-pitying cry from a man who had lost his kingdom and still couldn't comprehend that he had built it on stolen land. I read it twice. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, not even pity. It was simply information from a distant country I no longer visited. I folded the letter neatly, opened the bottom drawer of my writing desk, and placed it inside. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I simply gave it a place to exist, a quiet, dark space where it could not cast a shadow on the light-filled rooms of my present. The morning of my 84th birthday began with silence. Not the heavy, expectant silence of my old life, waiting for the phone to ring with obligatory, joyless greetings. This was a soft, gentle silence, filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the quiet hum of the city waking up 15 floors below. I made myself pancakes, drizzling them with the expensive maple syrup I used to save for special occasions. Every day was a special occasion now. At noon, Chloe arrived. She didn't bring a store-bought gift, but a small, handmade book bound in blue leather. Inside, on thick paper, she had written out her favorite poems, each one illustrated with her own delicate charcoal drawings. On the last page was her drawing of the oak tree, and beneath it, a single line. For my grandmother, who taught me how to grow roots and reach for the sun. Later, as we sat on the balcony, she looked at me, her head tilted. "You seem different, Grandma. Taller, somehow." I smiled. "That's what happens when you finally stop crouching." My days settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. I repotted the orchid the building manager had given me, its single, resilient bloom a testament to second chances. My friends, Carol and Margaret, came for weekly Scrabble games, our laughter echoing in the small apartment, a sound far warmer than the polite quiet of my old dining room. One morning, a simple text message appeared on my phone. "Happy birthday, S." I looked at it, then put my phone down and went back to watering my plants. It wasn't an act of anger or vengeance. I simply had nothing to say. My silence was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was just a state of peace. That evening, I sat at my writing desk and opened my journal. The first entry, written months ago in a shaky hand, had been full of fear and confusion. Now, my hand was steady. I thought about the ghost of that question, "What gives you the right?" that Simon had hurled at me. I dipped my pen in the ink, the cool glass of the bottle smooth under my fingers, and I finally wrote my answer. They once planned my legal death, believing my life was a story they had the right to finish. They were wrong. A life is not a book to be edited by others. It is a table you build for yourself. I tore down the old one, the one laden with bitter obligations and tasteless pies, and I have built a new one. It is small, but it is sturdy. It is made of honest wood. And here, at my own table, I finally know what I am serving. A feast of quiet sovereignty, seasoned with the salt of hard-won tears and the sweetness of a peace I earned myself. There is always a seat here for those who knock gently, but the head of the table is, and will always be, mine.